Animosity smoldered between them long after they had taken their seats in the temple's triforium. Merkener, in his best burgundy suit, sat beside Osmara, whose petite figure was lost in the lush folds of a dark velvet robe. She shot occasional glances across her eldest toward Cassandra. The princess was fuming. Her infuriated huffs and low, guarded growls disconcerted her brothers, Lunarier and Draco, seated innocently on her either side. Not wanting to be dragged into the fight, they instead focused intensely on the ceremony below. Vines of aromatic ivy strangled the demonic statues housed in the alcoves that arcaded the apse. The grotesques peered with menacing glares, guarding the sanctum and passing judgment on the petitions prayed before them. The successive arches of their hollows culminated in a tall, solitary window. The casements were a puzzle of stained glass. The magenta, cobalt, and saffron panes were spread open to starkly contrast the dark tempest outside. The sky was black and bloated with rain. Towering nimbus clouds wrestled to pin the sea's churning swells. A silvery thread of lightning stitched the seams between the sea and the sky, but could not mend the matter that had rattled the thunder and made the squalls scream. Cold, wet gusts poured through the open window. Nesu was splayed prostrate on the large obsidian mirror built into the floor before the tall open window. Rainwater traced the contours of his bare, muscular torso. His sopping, white ceremonial skirt was pasted transparent across his knees. There was a silence in his posture not common to the congregation. He had descended dimensions deep into tranquility. His presence would have lost all value were it not for the impatient stares of the squirming laity. They were uncomfortably seated on tasseled pillows and hid from the squalls behind the pillars of the side aisles. A raspy alto dirge distracted from the gathered, and every head turned to the adolescent acolyte who had led a dozen armored soldiers into position around a sarcophagus. The petrified effigy of a soldier slumbered on the stone slab. The knights genuflected, took the reliquary by its wrought handles, then stood and lifted it even with their shoulders. The clatter of their procession down the nave kept time with the haunting hymn. The congregation rose from their pillow as the coffin drifted past. As the song echoed into obscurity, the sarcophagus was laid to rest at the foot of the steps ascending to the dais. A moment passed silent, save for the gurgle of rain pouring through the open window. With a long, slow exhale, Nesu extricated himself from his tranquil state. His eyes flickered back into focus, and soon his features had relaxed back to their usual scowl. Nesu peeled himself out of his prostration. His bare feet smacked against the wet floor as he turned and descended the stairs. The golden chains that linked his bracelets to his rings tinkered as he lifted his hands over the effigy. Taoesh black magic. Tao Mei, you whom have suffered like Renalian. Renalian endured. His story has been echoed. Echo his actions in your lives. Nesu dabbed his fingers in a dish of concentrated vinegar on a nearby pedestal, then flicked at the sarcophagus. The droplets shattered against the statue and spotted Renalian's fossilized remains like tears. The acid blistered the rock and gave off strands of gray vapor. The fumes tainted the incense, and the once sweet scent grew bitter. The acolyte who had led the procession, a young boy whose complexion was as dark as tree bark, handed Nesu an embroidered towel. As the Hierophant dried his hands, the kneeling knights lifted Renalian with their usual clatter, then retreated to the large black doors at the end of the nave. Acolytes from various stations around the temple descended to where the sarcophagus had lain. All were children, and dressed in the same regalia as the Hierophant, a white skirt, gold cuffs on their wrists and ankles, and a filigree pectoral strung from their necks. The immature devotees coalesced around the vizier as he followed the sarcophagus out of the sanctuary. With the ceremony concluded, the gathered nobility, dignitaries, and gentry rose from their pillows and meandered out. The congregation's cacophonous escape faded down the halls, and soon the temple was empty save for the royal family still seated in silent contemplation on thrones in the triforium. They always stayed seated well after the rest of the congregation left. Quiet footsteps from below made their way through the nave. The storm's noise was muffled as the stained glass shutters were shut. Merkener and Lunarier traded impatient glances, desperate to carry on with the festivities. Waiting silently with no distraction in an empty chamber was of little value. Draco glared threateningly at his younger brothers in a mute attempt to pacify them. After a loud and adventurous life, Draco understood the value of silence and the patient contemplation possible while alone in a temple. The acolytes downstairs extinguished the last of the sconces. The temple was doused in darkness. Details drowned in the shadows. The pitch was as black and muted as an abyss. An arm could reach forever in every direction and never find anything. Was it worth searching for? Or would it find her first? Cassandra struggled to answer that question, but could solve it no more quickly now in the temple than she did at night in the dark of her room. She wanted to discover. Her curiosity was free to explore during meditation or in the lucid lulls which spotted her sleep, but she wanted more than her curiosity could offer. There was something lurking beyond the grasp of her imagination, waiting for it to find her, to be inspired by it, picked by it, or pulled toward it, left her out of control of the situation. A bad state for a witch. Why was it too shy to present itself? What was it that restrained her? Why was she kept from grasping it? Terracon was too naive to see that he was merely the latest sacrifice to the machinations of the curse. It did not matter that he had been like a brother to her. None of the princes had ever understood, and they were closer to the matter than Terracon could ever hope to be. Only in bearing the curse did she and her sisters understand how it fascinated, how it begged with chronic malcontent to step beyond some ill-defined and arbitrary barrier. It never accepted, never appreciated, was never satisfied. Blame did not bring justice. It only extrapolated sympathy to every witch burdened by the curse. No mother, sister, or daughter had ever been anything more than a neglected byproduct. They all felt it, but struggled to acknowledge that any other might also know the plight. Sympathy for Cassandra's discontent festered Osmara's own pangs. After 4 centuries of gnawing distractions, she had hoped she had more control over the curse than this. She quickly battened her crumbling condition with a superficial occupation of perusing the temple's architecture and giving a dismissive sigh. Draco raised an eyebrow to his mother. He and his brothers had been waiting long enough for their mother and sister to find some reconciliation in the silence that haunted the sacred space. The temple's meditative silence was slashed by the hissing drawback of a tapestry from a doorway. Nesu ascended into the triforium and puddled its floor with the rainwater that trickled down his gilded ankles. His white skirt clapped loudly under its own weight as he approached. Osmara turned to peek over her shoulder. Her laughter was stifled into a snort. She hid a smile behind her hand and commented, "It was a lovely ceremony," as he loomed over them. Nesu ran his hand along his clean-shaven head, but failed to wipe away all of the water. The bath that encased him breathed off its cold and sent shivers down Cassandra, scantily costumed for the festival and seated not far from where the vizier stood. "It was certainly enlightening," Nesu grumbled. He traced his hands down his arms to peel the water from his skin. It poured from his fingers onto the floor. "I venture to say that had today's meditation been on anything but Renalian sacrifice, I would not have made it through these," he fumbled for a precise term, "distractions." He shrugged off more water, then returned his attention to the queen. "I will need a temporary recess before I can attend the festivities, and I am sure that I am not the only one who would appreciate a moment to finish up," he warmly added, tracing his fingers against the soft underbelly of Cassandra's chin. "Yes, I am quite ready to move on with this day," Osmara concurred, smiling. "Come along, you lot," she chirped at her children. "We will be waiting in the great hall," she added to Nesu. Draco offered his hand to gracefully lift Osmara from her seat, then followed the rest of the family out through the curtained door. A forest of boots and skirts held aloft a canopy of capped and hen-inspired heads. Elbows fenced, jabbed into ribs, and instigated more than a few unforgiving glares. Warlocks threw their arms around one another, greeted their long-lost brothers, and admired each other's luck and spouses. Witches shepherded their familial herds into positions near sisters in whose company and influence they reveled. Terracon was lost amid the limbs. He was thankful that the windows had been left open despite the storm, and that the air was not choked with the stench of 100 witches waiting impatiently to be the first to enter the great hall. A deep gurgle from the hinges grew into a squeal as the round black doors, scrawled with a golden filigree grill, parted. Terracon did not need to move. The witches and warlocks pouring through the circular passage pulled him in their current as they cascaded down the stairs and poured out across the great hall's sunken black marble floor. Their heels clacked like stones in an avalanche as they maneuvered to the overstuffed pillows seated around the long black tables, intersecting in the center of the room and low enough that their lacquered tops were even with the stage where the royal family would be seated. This was a comparably small great hall, nothing like the vaulted auditoriums of Castle Sasane or Domara. Osmara did not like to entertain as many guests as her mother's had. What it lacked in space, however, it made up for in opulence. Rows of massive white marble pillars framed the room. A complex canopy of vaults branched from the pillars and culminated in architectural stalactites. Lanterns hung from each point. Their panes of opaque glass calmed the flickering firelight to a steady ambient glow. Black curtains trimmed with gold fringe could be drawn between the pillars to partition away the small tables behind the colonnade. Though such private spaces were usually fought for, today they were largely abandoned. Nobody dared risk missing the highlight of today's feast, the dance of De Toutal. Terracon was among those competing for a favorite seat at the low tables. Nobles such as the Baron Harmond and his sister, the Duchess Maioret, had already settled on the cushions nearest the stage. Terracon quickly maneuvered to a nook where the two main tables intersected. He settled himself on a velvet cushion and stared to the stage. Behind the high table, wooden thrones were hung from the ceiling by chains. Beyond the royal family's swinging seats, at the back of the stage, a face peeked through the black drapery. Terracon watched inquisitively as Cassandra perused the festivities. She had not noticed him. She was too occupied examining the multitude still flooding the room. A warlock in a dark suit leaned flirtatiously toward a receptive dark-haired witch. One witch pulled tightly on a boy's tunic, trying to straighten the seams before seating him next to her. A large Ioplean man, recognizable from his fur-trimmed blue satin coat and jewel-pinned turban, was settling into one of the recessed booths. "Is everything all right, Cassandra?" Osmara asked. The thick black curtain fell limp as Cassandra turned away from the gathering. "Oh, no, nothing is wrong. I'm fine." Hot, nervous thoughts slithered around her, distracted her from concentrating on any one thing. She sighed her anxiety and asked, "Where's my headdress?" There was a familiar jingle as a lady's maid approached. The rim of a golden diadem, strung with chains of coins, was pinched in her hands. Cassandra reached for it, but Osmara snatched at it first and pulled it defensively away from her daughter. "Have a seat, my dear. You are going to make yourself ill," Osmara warmly commanded. It was an uncomfortable change from the row that had passed between them earlier that morning. Osmara was hoping to show her maturity in letting matters be forgiven and forgotten, but the message was lost on Cassandra, preoccupied with failing confidence. She knew the dance, so why was she suddenly too fragile to perform it? She seated herself and petted out the folds of her black silk dress. Osmara hovered the diadem over the princess's head, visually perfecting its alignment before setting it in place. The coins chimed as Osmara pulled the chains into alignment. "There, do you see? Perfect." Cassandra shot a shy glance at her reflection, but then fidgeted instead with her rings, turning them around and pressing the pearls into her palm. "It is about time that we begin, so I will ready the musicians," Osmara said. She leaned over Cassandra's shoulder and stared at her through the mirror. "Your brothers and I are very proud to see this performance." She wrapped her skeletal arms reaffirmingly around her daughter. Cassandra held her breath as her mother's meager muscles tensed in a warm embrace, then drifted off with a soft tickle. The drapery hissed as Osmara fell beyond it, and Cassandra was left alone by the vanity. The muffled voice of her mother could barely be heard through the curtain. Cassandra quickly picked up her last tinkling piece of jewelry, a veil of pearl strands. She fastened the band behind her head and stared into the mirror. The costume was complete. The applause began. Cassandra turned away from the vanity. She passed through the heavy velvet curtains and pulled them tightly shut behind her. 8 musicians haunted a corner of the stage and stared at her with anticipation. She had practiced the dance too many times not to be ready, but could not start until she remembered how she had come to be on that stage. De Toutal was a celebration of the anomaly, of the happenstances by which black magic communicated and manifested its desires. A tribute to those coincidences was made in syncopated rhythms, and the dance was a plea for such epiphanies to continue. Because the curse bound the daughters of Hexen close to black magic, their prayers were believed to be the most effective, and they were thus burdened with the performance. Tradition dictated that the honor fall to the second daughter, the fastidious virgin of the house. As the only daughter in her generation, Cassandra was not permitted to refuse the obligation and suffered through months of practice while still maintaining her militaristic first daughter duties. During the lessons, the dance seemed awkward. Only since yesterday's accidental discovery had it begun to have any personal meaning. Stumbling upon the book made her feel special, like she was involved in some greater occult scheme, and she desperately hoped that it was a sign. There already were several other interesting overlaps that suggested that year's festivities were somehow significant. Where Renalian's bravery and devotion were commemorated every year, De Tutal happened only once a century, and it was by a mere calendrical coincidence that the two holidays converged that day. It was also the first time in 400 years where Queen Osmara would not be dancing. Absurd as it seemed for someone as old as Her Majesty to still have to perform, she had been the second daughter in her generation and the last princess born. For centuries, she performed with dignity, and finally the time had come for Cassandra to bear the burden. She could not fail tonight's performance. There was no choice other than to be prepared. As frustrated as she felt at having no control, she submitted to the demands of others, let herself be picked and pulled against her will.